Thanks, everyone. We're at 10:02, so I'd like to resume. Can I just check with the council a practical matter? Looking at the time, is this? Am I right in thinking that we have to be out of this building at 5 o'clock? Is that right? If someone could check that, that would be useful.
Let us check, sir. I mean, hopefully we can accommodate everything we need to today. 5 p.m. I think we can move through health quickly. We've seen some of the reps. I've got some changes on health, so we can get through that.
Okay, well, if everyone can bear that in mind, I don't want to cut anybody short, but if we can keep submissions as concise as possible, I think that might help. Professor May, I'll come to you without further ado.
Thank you very much, sir, and I'll try to be as brief as I can. We in the Civic Trust were broadly supportive of the content of the revisions to CC2 as they focus on new domestic and non-domestic buildings. But the Council helpfully reminded us in their response that NPPF 2012 advises that local planning authorities should, and I quote, actively support energy efficiency improvements to existing buildings. For some reason, all references to this seem to have been removed from the revised policy. In particular, the deletion of paragraphs 11, 19 and 20 removes the commitment that the Council, and again I quote, will support homeowners in delivering energy efficiency improvements. Mr. Henderson's already alerted us that 62% of current carbon emissions come from domestic and non-domestic buildings. And looking further in the climate strategy, there's a target to retrofit 32,700 dwellings by 2030. And yet we're in a position where, as Ms. Jukes has reminded us, the Council is rejecting proposals for photovoltaics and indeed air source heat pumps in particular situations. And we really feel that this needs to be resolved. What we'd like to suggest is that a new policy, let's call it CC4, might be drafted, which deals specifically with the way in which, in planning terms, the Council is going to deliver its 32,700 retrofitted buildings, dwellings, by 2030. I don't propose to offer a draft, I just raise the concern. Thank you.
Mr. Merrick.
Yes, thank you. We'd like to welcome the Council's strengthening of the expectations in this revised CC2 policy. And, you know, in terms of the challenges that have been made earlier, we absolutely support them resisting those. You know, there is enormous, clear local public support for ambitious climate change targets, and we need the mechanisms to deliver them. I have a number of queries, but can I also support the Civic Trust and Mr. May representation about the issue of retrofitting of existing properties? We couldn't understand either why the consequential improvement to existing dwelling section of the policy and the supporting text has been deleted, and either that needs to be reinstated and strengthened, or a separate policy has been, as suggested by the Civic Trust, adopted to address that issue. However, we are also concerned that this policy, which is the one aimed at buildings, does not clearly address the issue of embodied carbon. Whilst the BREEAM and the other LEED system of assessing sustainable development do include looking at that aspect, of course, because it is a point system, you can actually achieve an excellent rating without necessarily addressing the embodied carbon issues involved in the construction. There was quite a good article about the major new development in London, which achieved excellent, but was absolutely a mass of concrete and steel, both of which have very high carbon footprints. So in that sense, the existing policy is not enough to deal with the embodied carbon issue. And obviously it also doesn't deal with the issue of how much carbon is used in the construction processes. So we strongly suggest that we'd like to see an additional policy that directly deals with the embodied carbon issue. We, in our submission, drew attention to the North Lincolnshire one, which we think would be a good basis for writing a similar policy for York. Finally, I have two other more minor questions on the policy modifications. In the first section, the third bullet point it refers to consideration of good practice. We feel that's a rather weak wording. I think we'd prefer compliance with good practice. Then at the end of section A of the policy, there's a final brief paragraph saying any other level of reductions required through building regs or other legislation will supersede the above requirements. Now, we weren't quite clear why that's there and what its intent is and what its results will be. Does that apply if there are new building regs higher than the council is requiring, or if there are new changes to the building regs which lower them, do we end up with a lower requirement? As I say, we didn't find it very easy to understand what that was trying to do and to make a judgment on whether it was appropriate or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt. Councillor Waters, did you have something you wanted to add, and then I'll come to the council.
Please, very, very briefly, and it's more for my own sanity than anything else. The discussion around paragraph 11.13b I found very interesting earlier on, but I picked up on the comment made by Mr. Henderson when he said that the council would go away and tidy up that paragraph. Now, to me, it hinges largely on one word. Policy CC2 therefore encourages developers, etc., etc. Now, the council's either going to leave that word in and the policy becomes an aim, or they're going to tidy it up and put the word requires in.
They're not going to leave the word encourage in.
Right, thank you. My sanity is restored. I was just so confused with all that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Henderson.
I'm very grateful to Inspector Bartley for dealing with that. Mr. May and his comment. The short answer is the council looked at what could be achieved in a proportionate manner, and the wording that was removed at the bottom of policy CC2 was removed because it wasn't considered to be proportionate. What we dealt with in the earlier parts of the policy was trying to strike the balance between essentially which developments would be within and which would be without. For example, Part B dealing with an internal floor area of 100 metres squared. You've heard, in essence, the other side of the argument before we got to the break about this all being far too onerous, and the council's had to strike the balance somewhere. And it is done so here. Essentially, it wasn't proportionate as part of an application or the development management process to leave those words in. We are, though, in terms of the general aspiration, happy to go back to 1120, and we will leave in the words the council will support homeowners in delivering efficiency improvements that Mr. May raised. So insofar as those words are a general aspiration to be included in supporting text, that part of the final sentence of that paragraph I'm happy to leave in. But we can't go any further because it would simply be disproportionate on those sorts of small-scale homeowner applications. And it should also be recalled, of course, that this is a policy that is to be applied to development. And a vast majority of the retrofitting that is required, which is a laudable aim, is unlikely to actually require planning permission, applying section 55 and 57 of the Act, and having regard, of course, to the GPDO, which covers many of the issues which might also be relied on there. So that's another reason why a proportionate approach is required here. So that's Mr. May's submissions and, of course, no new policy as a result of what I've just said.
Sorry if I can just interrupt. The sort of policy that Mr. May was talking about, Mr. Henderson, is that something that is likely, rather than being dealt with through this local plan, but rather be something that was in the, I think you said there was a delivery document that's yet to be produced supporting the strategy? Is that where that kind of thing would be?
So yes, because if you look at 1120, the remainder of that sentence talks about financial support initiatives. There are a range of those which are available to those living within the city, which would be identified in documents such as that action plan. And that really isn't to do with development control. That's to do with, as I said at the start, one of those other initiatives that are available to the council to address those objectives. So yes, that sort of document, and Mr. Gibbons, as the author, I'm sure, has made a careful note of your suggestion, but not for policy, sir.
It wasn't a suggestion. I'm not here to make suggestions about other council documents.
So I'm grateful. So Mr. Merritt, then, I can take the points pretty quickly. The first one was about the word consider in the final bullet point at the start. We don't think this needs to be strengthened. We have sufficient strength in the detailed criteria that follow. What this opening is doing is highlighting that this is the trigger. We're into the consideration of this issue. Nothing more is needed in my submission. I'll take the third point that Mr. Merritt made. This is about any other level. Yeah, we could clarify that. So we will clarify it to make clear that it's any other higher level of reductions. I'm perfectly happy to do that. And then the second point was embodied carbon, and Mr. Gibbons will just deal with that.
Yeah, I think it was highlighted in Mr. Merritt's own statement that BREEAM does address embodied carbon, and we stated before the break how we believe that BREEAM is achievable but challenging. I think it would be extremely unwise for any new development to ignore an entire section of BREEAM to achieve the credits required under that policy. So we consider that embedded carbon would be addressed through the BREEAM requirements.
And yeah, the point about construction, carbon in construction, or embodied carbon in construction materials.
As far as I'm aware, that's part of the embodied carbon in the BREEAM assessment, but I might be wrong with that. I can go and check.
So the other point, if we go back to WM2 from this morning, I think I actually highlighted this as we went through. Let me pull it up whilst we are talking about it. WM2, minimising the consumption and requiring good practice by reuse, recycling and disposal of construction materials. And my submission insofar as it's a development control issue, that is sufficient to deal with that. Actually, this is a really good example of climate change permeating the plan rather than simply being in this section. So taking that together with what Mr. Gibbons has explained, we say that's an adequate approach here.
Okay, Mr. Merritt.
Can I come back on one point? I assume your response to my point about the consequential improvements was the same proportionate point that you made about, in terms of Mr. May's comment. Can I question whether it is not the proportionality? We know that most existing buildings are going to have to be retrofitted by 2050 or within the next couple of decades. Is it therefore disproportionate to actually expect extensions and so on to meet the higher standards that they're going to have to meet in due course anyway, but will be much cheaper to do if you do it right in the first place? I don't think it is disproportionate given what we know is coming down the track.
I think, just to be really clear, there's a distinction between a new extension to which the building regs would apply and retrofitting, which, although the building regs might apply in isolation depending on what works are being undertaken, they're not going to be a development management issue in the vast majority of cases. And so the balance we've struck is to say, look, the building regs are moving in that direction. The question is, do we have to speed up the person who wants to put on an extension that's a metre longer than GPDO? The answer is that's disproportionate in the context of those small homeowner schemes, especially when what could the council actually require, thinking about the NPPF and conditions? Yes, it could impose a condition on the extension, but there would certainly be a question mark over how far that condition could then say, and can you change the roof of your existing building at the same time? I suspect the answer to that is no. So again, that's another good example of why in these smaller homeowner applications, this is where we think the balance lies.
Mr. May, did you want to add something?
Just very briefly, sir. I should make clear I'm not a town planner and don't pretend to be an expert in town planning, but I am concerned that at the moment we have an inconsistency, a major inconsistency, between a council policy that looks for retrofitting and a development control policy that's denying a significant proportion of homeowners the opportunity to make changes. I don't know what's the best way of dealing with this, but I would have expected an issue like this to be reflected in a local plan, given that NPPF 2012 specifies that as the topic. But I would simply, sirs, leave this to you because you're much more expert than I am in how you tackle this. I just feel it needs tackling.
So, really quick, there is no inconsistency. The fact that a wider policy might have that as an objective doesn't mean it has to be reflected in the land use plan, and I touched on that at the start precisely for these sorts of submissions. We can deal with retrofitting through those other initiatives, financial initiatives, etc., in a strategy and an implementation plan without needing to include them as a development control policy, especially when they're unlikely in many cases to raise development control issues. The second point was about denying the opportunity. Absolutely not. There is no need to have a policy in order to afford people the opportunity to retrofit their properties if they wish to do so. Insofar as we want to indicate our support for that, I've already said we'll put back in that part of the sentence which in the supporting text which does that. Nothing further is required for the purposes of this, the land use plan.
Thank you. Is that nameplate on Ender? Yes, carry on.
Okay, thanks. I'll be very quick because the points have already been made by the Civic Trust and the Environment Forum. We also welcome, from York Labour, we welcome the beefing up of the targets for new developments, and we urge the Council to resist the challenges that they've heard here today. But we similarly share concerns over the issues around retrofit, and we don't think they're being treated with enough seriousness. So, for example, I'm a councillor for Micklegate, which is in the middle of York, and we have people being told they need to take air source heat pumps off their buildings because you can see them from the city walls. We need some high-level direction that permits those kind of things to happen in the city. And just to stress the point about embedded carbon, happy for clarification to be given, but we're not convinced that BREEAM really deals adequately with the issue of embedded carbon. It's already been, examples have already been given of BREEAM excellent schemes that have got tons and tons of embedded carbon in them. We've had examples given of other councils that have introduced policies to deal with embedded carbon, and it's such a big issue because as we move towards net zero, as our buildings start to become net zero, then the only carbon in them is going to be in the construction and in the fabric as they're built in the future. So I think it's important that we do address this now in our local plan with some high-level policies on it. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Henderson, was there anything you wanted to add?
So I think you've heard my submissions on that, unless there's anything that you feel I haven't addressed.
I'm content to take that away and consider it further, but I do recognise the force of what's being said. Retrofitting is difficult, though, in that, yeah, often there will be elements of changes that people want to make to buildings, like a visible air source heat pump or something like that, that would come under DC or development control, but a lot of it, insulation, cavity walls, that sort of thing, not development, so you can't have a policy aimed at trying to deal with it, but I think best left with us, if I may leave it like that. Good.
Sorry, could I just query, insulation, if it's external wall insulation, which affects the appearance of the building, I thought that was a development control issue.
I think if it have changed the appearance of, I'm thinking on my feet a little bit, but if it changes the appearance of a building, yeah, that would most likely be development.
Yeah,
if
section
it's external.
A1.
Yeah, and if you read the literature, whilst there's a balance between the two, the general preference seems to be in terms of the effectiveness and carbon reductions. The external wall has more to say for it because you don't get the cold bridging effects that you get with internal insulation. So if that's going to be a significant part of 32,000 properties,
I'll take that point away, Mr. Merritt. Thank you. Can we move on to policy? Oh, Councillor Waters, go on.
Just briefly, sir. Presumably having some sort of policy to promote solar roof tile use over and above PV panel use, especially in the middle of town or Micklegate and places like that, ought to be a consideration.
Again, I suppose the question is whether it's development. If it's on a listed building, it would be works, but is it development, I suppose, is the question.
Precisely, sir. It may not materially affect the external appearance of the building. There's also the borough's case about roofs and lifts and what can you see and where do you look at it from. All very interesting questions, but even if it is development control, that's the sort of detailed issue that doesn't need to be addressed in this plan.
The point be that they could be dealt with under other policies in the plan, because the general consideration would be balancing an impact on the appearance of a building or an area against the benefits that would come from improved energy efficiency.
Quite so, sir. If we start at the start of the plan with the visions, the objectives, they give you the broad support. We've then got the design policies that we've already looked at last week that, in my submission, have sufficient scope to accommodate this issue in that context. To just add, of course, in York there will be heritage concerns, but I don't see any feasible way we can have a policy that gives an indication one way or the other. We've got heritage policies that deal with the balance in accordance with the MPPF, and we really can't go outside of that.
That's helpful, thank you. I'm going to suggest we move on, conscious of time, and deal with. Does anyone have any submissions to make, in particular on CC3? the district heating policy that Mr Henderson took us through when we started. In which case, then, that there are submissions that people want to make about the suite of policies, and I'll happily hear that now, Mr Merritt. Go on then.
Yes. It was as much questions about some of the changes. Certainly welcome the change to para A. On para B, I think our question is this reference to identified future opportunities. What does that actually mean? Because the council is at the same time crossing out the references to the existing evidence base. And does that mean if an application comes in, then what future opportunities are we referring to? What basis can a judgment be made? Particularly as some of, certainly on some of the, in some of the PPGs, for some aspects, the policy, it says that the local plan should define where opportunities exist in order, and if you don't have them defined in the local plan, you don't appear then to be able to have such development. Notably on major solar, wind, etc.
Yeah, so I think so. I'm instructed there are no sites with sufficient certainty that we could identify in the plan by name. So what we've done in lieu of that is adopt essentially the auditing approach, and just dealing with the specific part that in Part B that was raised. Major developments will need to assess, so that's the audit, the feasibility and viability of identified future network opportunities. And in our submission, that's a perfectly appropriate approach. You undertake your assessment. Can I identify any appropriate opportunities sufficiently proximate to the site? See paragraph 1128, paragraph 2 in particular. And if you can, that is covered. And if you can't, then you move on to the next part of the sequence. So, frankly, unless Mr Merritt has some specific examples that we've overlooked and we need to identify, that's the end of the matter. We can do no more.
Mr Merritt?
Certainly the previous evidence base did have a number of areas suitable for some of those different functions. It was quite an extensive study that was done.
Well, so the short answer on that is if Mr Merritt can provide those to Mr Gibbons will consider whether there's been any omissions, and if there has, we will propose a change in due course on that basis.
Would there be an issue in identifying those specifically in this plan? Because it may well be, might it not, that other opportunities might become apparent with the passage of time, but they clearly would not be identified in the plan. That might cause you problems, potentially missed opportunities, I think, if you were to go about it that way.
Absolutely, sir. We would have to bolt on any specific identification on top of the auditing approach that we've already got in there, because it's that auditing approach that would capture those new developments that you've highlighted. So the policy would remain the same, and if there are, for whatever reason, anything that we've overlooked that Mr Merritt's able to identify, Mr Gibbons, that would be added on simply in supporting text.
I'll leave that between you. Can we deal with the submissions on the suite of policies? Mr May, do you want to go first?
Thank you, sir. You asked the question, wholly appropriately, is the suite of policies a sufficiently comprehensive response to this issue, by which I think you mean the broad issue of climate change? And the Council has advised you in its response that it is. Mr Henderson, I wanted to make 4 points if I could. First of all, Mr Henderson helpfully pointed you to the pie chart in CYC 104, which shows the distribution of current net emissions. It's actually very difficult to see how any of policies CC1 to CC3 help reduce those. We've already heard that policy CC2 is dealing with new buildings, and of course new buildings by definition are not in this set of emissions. So it's not clear to me how the Council can claim that it is comprehensive. I think I heard Mr. Henderson in his preamble suggesting that it didn't need to be because that was done elsewhere. But frankly, looking through the revisions elsewhere in the local plan, there doesn't seem to be an overarching statement anywhere. Secondly, in terms of covering this comprehensively, the draft and the Council's response do refer to some of the helpful targets in the draft climate change strategy. The 56% reduction from 2005 to 2030 for domestic building carbon, the 37% reduction for non-domestic buildings. There's no reference to the other critical targets, 71% for transport, as we were hearing last week, 63% for commercial and industrial activity, and it's not clear to me where that fits into the plan, 41% for waste, 12% for agricultural and land use. So the document as it stands isn't comprehensive in its coverage of the Council's own targets. A third point, the Council's draft climate change strategy sets a target of a 77% reduction overall in carbon emissions from 2005 to 2030. It also notes that that doesn't get us to the Paris Accord requirements. What is needed for that is an 88% reduction, and the difference has to come from sequestration in the main. Some offsetting, but to a large extent sequestration. And by far the most effective way of achieving sequestration is to make more carbon efficient use of green space. So this is a green infrastructure issue which isn't at the moment adequately reflected there. So in summary, we wholeheartedly agreed with the Home Builders Federation statement in their submission that climate change is not an issue that can just be addressed by three policies and is in fact a consideration that needs to be incorporated and considered throughout the plan. Prompted by Mr. Henderson's comments at the outset, I wonder whether the place to do this, therefore, isn't in sections 1 and 2 of the plan, and certainly those at the moment do not reflect the Council's climate strategy. We were, prior to my hearing Mr. Henderson this afternoon, going to suggest a new overarching policy CC0, which sets out the Council's climate change strategy, indicates clearly the linkages with other parts of the local plan. And we would expect those linkages, wherever they come, to be to Section 9 on green infrastructure, for the reason I've given, to Section 13 on waste, given that there's a target there, to Section 14 on transport and communications. And there also needs to be a link to policies C1, DP2, and SS1, because one of the targets in the climate change strategy is a 25% reduction in person travel. And that can only be delivered by changing the way in which land use and transport interact. And therefore it must be central to those land use planning strategies. So in summary, somewhere in this document, there needs to be this overarching statement, and it needs to show how these other policies, together with CC 1, 2, and 3, contribute to that strategy.
Mr. Merritt, did you want to make a submission on this question too? Well, I think if I allow you to do that, and then I'll come to Mr. Henderson and others. Go on.
We were coming from a broadly similar position in terms of wanting to see a clear overarching policy that encompasses all the areas that are covered in the local plan in terms of the carbon aspects. Mr. May's referred to sections 1 and 2 of the document. Section 1, which is the background section, still has in paragraphs 1.19 to 1.21 references to the 2010 carbon strategy. There's no modifications being proposed to update it to the current one that I could see when I was hunting through the documents for it. If you recall, at the phase 2 hearings, Miss Cook, I think for the Elvington development, was making the point that there needed not just to be modifications to the section, but also to the overall strategy and vision. If you look at the existing vision statement in section 2 of the plan, the reference to climate change is incredibly weak. Sorry, if I can just bring up the right page. The vision statement's reference is: the plan will ensure that the vision outcomes are delivered in a sustainable way that recognises the challenges of climate change, protects residents, etc. We would like to suggest that given the Council's adoption of a net zero target, that should be written into the vision statement. It is so fundamental to what happens in this city and what the local plan needs to develop that it should be there up front in the plan as a clear stated objective of the plan. And I think that's reasonable. If you go to the government's PPG on climate change, if you look at page 3, the paragraph 001 section of it, it does make clear that there is a statutory duty on local planning authorities to include policies in the local plan designed to tackle climate change and its impacts, and that they complement the sustainable development duty on plan makers, i.e. it's separate requirement. And the National Planning Policy Framework emphasises that responding to climate change is central to the economic, social and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. So I think the inclusion of that in the overall vision statement is in line with the government's guidance and is in line with what the Council has set out as its ambition in terms of addressing this existential threat to our society and civilization. I'd also reference DP2 as one of the sections where we clearly need for that to be amended to recognise the net zero carbon specifically. And I'll leave my comments at that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt. Councillor, you wanted to speak to.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And again, just very briefly, because most of the points have already been made. In terms of answering the question, is the suite of policies sufficiently comprehensive? We would say no, because they fail to tackle head-on the 3 major causes of carbon emissions within the city. We've already talked at some length about houses and dwellings and commercial, but the fact that there's no mention of transport in this policy at all is baffling. It's not good enough to say that it's dealt with elsewhere. It needs to be there front and centre, and there needs to be some strong commitments and strong policies for zero carbon transport, low carbon transport laid out from the start. It feels a little bit as though it feels a lot as though the whole issue is being avoided. Maybe burying the head in the potholes, and it needs to be addressed front and centre. And if you're going to have a climate change policy, then that's where it needs to be.
Thank you. Is there anything else on the sweep? All right, I'm going to come back to Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson.
So I'm grateful. So I think we can group the submissions that have been made into essentially two issues. The first issue is it comprehensive enough? And the second issue is, do we need a new policy? Let me deal with each of those in turn. So the first issue, is this comprehensive enough? I return to what I said earlier. Section 19, subsection 1A, contribute towards the mitigation and adaptation. It's a contribution in the context of all the other measures. Now, the arguments that have been made, I'm afraid, stray outside of what can be achieved here. The Civic Trust argument I'll put on the basis of a comparison. Well, what have the Council identified as targets in their draft strategy, emphasis draft, and what have they included in their plan? That's not, in my submission, the appropriate comparator, because the scope of that strategy is so much wider than the scope of what is being included in the plan. I take Councillor Kilbane's example, zero carbon transport buses. That's not a development control issue or matter that goes into a land use plan. It just doesn't involve development. It might be a very important part of what the Council wishes to do in tackling climate change, but that doesn't need and cannot find its way into this local plan. Flipping it around, the omission of such matters does not go to soundness. That, in essence, captures a lot of what you heard from the Civic Trust as well. Reference was made to those targets, but those targets are not to be achieved just through land use planning. It's through this plan and a range of other measures. So it's not a fair comparison for the purposes of assessing what is or isn't comprehensive. The better approach is the approach which the Council has adopted, which is to identify those matters which do fall within the scope of this plan and to address it. That's the first issue. The second issue is, well, do we need an overarching policy? And I was listening really carefully to understand what this overarching policy would contain. And basically, it's a policy that says we need to deal with climate change and then cross-references to all the different policies that deal with different aspects of climate change. We simply don't need that for the purposes of soundness. In particular, given the proposed amendment to DP2, and I read that out so that everyone has it fresh in their mind, mitigate and adapt to climate change through designing new communities and buildings, transport network and services that support each community to be energy and resource efficient and reduce carbon emissions. So we have an overarching statement insofar as we need one in DP2. What we then have is policies, some in green infrastructure, some in transport, some in this section, and design policies as well. Waste that we went through this morning, flooding that we went through this morning, all of which pull together insofar as this plan is able to do so, to deal with the issue. Simply having an extra policy over the top isn't going to add anything and isn't required for soundness. So, and that's really the second issue, sir. And once we've dealt with that, that's it. There is no other basis on which it's said this is unsound.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. If anyone has anything brief they want to say in response to that, Mr. Merritt.
I understand some of the points that Mr. Henderson's making, but I pick up his point that the better approach is that those matters that are appropriately dealt with in the plan are done so. But if we go back to the discussions on the transport issues, as we identified at both at the Phase 2 hearings, but also again last week, the transport consequences of development, which is absolutely a local plan issue, have not been adequately addressed. There is a complete mismatch between the carbon implications of the Council's own evidence growth in traffic with that is required from the Council's carbon strategy. Total mismatch. So in that sense, it may be a good argument in principle, but it is not delivered in practice. I think what I was envisaging in an overall plan is a reference to the targets that the council did see fit previously to include in policy CC1, actually being in that overarching policy. That would be the appropriate place to put updated targets reflecting the emerging climate strategy. And that climate strategy is probably very near approval at the moment, and those finalised targets could be incorporated in the final set of modifications that you are obviously going to be discussing with the council, and that are proposed to be published for further public consultation in, broadly speaking, in February, in the light of what we were told yesterday. So I'd make those points very strongly. Thank you.
Mr. May.
Thank you, sir.
I would say this is going to be the last chance for everyone. We won't be coming back. So anything that you need to say, let's hear it now.
Well, briefly, and I understand Mr. Henderson's point that what is included here should be relevant to local planning, land use planning. And I would simply observe that in the question of the interaction between transport and land use, density of development, mix of development, size of development are all critical to encouraging shorter journeys and journeys by active travel. In any comprehensive transport strategy to tackle climate change, those would be right up at the top of the list, and those are not there. And equally, I mentioned sequestration. It does seem to me that green infrastructure and how you use it is fundamentally a land use planning issue, and that's critical for sequestration. It's not there. So I'm happy to accept the limitation that what's included should only be relevant to land use planning, but there's a very great deal other than CC 1, 2 and 3, which is a land use planning issue which will help Mr. Gibbon and his colleagues deliver their climate strategy.
Anybody else? Yeah, go on. And then I'll come to you, Mr. Barrett.
Okay, thank you, sir. I might have misheard, but Mr. Henderson's argument appeared to me to say that we don't have to cover those issues in this policy because we don't have to. So we're not, which actually kind of sums up the administration's approach to transport. I just find it inconceivable that it would not be one of the biggest causes of greenhouse gas emissions is not being addressed in the centrepiece of the climate change policy, and there's no reason whatsoever why it can't be written in there that, you know, far more strongly that the council favours low carbon, which will be buses, and zero carbon, which will be walking developments that encourage that behaviour change. We are relying upon people to voluntarily switch to low or zero carbon methods of transport. I think 35% of the carbon reduction in transport, we're relying on people to voluntarily switch the way that they move around the city. Well, what we need to do is plan for people to move around the city in a way that doesn't create CO2 emissions, and it should be front and centre in this policy.
Thank you. Mr. Barrett, if we can be...
I'll be very quick because I've got a train at 3 minutes past 5. But it's just with regard to the matters of whether a plan is unsound or sound with regard to the modifications, and really going back to the 75%. And obviously it is a modification being proposed by the council, and whether it would be unsound without that modification. Obviously, clearly that is the consideration that you have to give to modifications being proposed, and whether actually that 75% inclusion is required for the soundness of this local plan. And I think that is the fundamental point. And it's just really reiterated what Mr. Henderson just raised. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything, Mr. Henderson, you feel you need to come back on? Because I really do want to get on
I'll
to
deal with that last point. So we had a figure in before that just wasn't the right figure. It didn't work, so we had to update it. That's where the 75% is coming from. So yes, it is necessary for soundness, because what was there wasn't sound. We've put the right figure in. I mean, everything else, I think I've really covered, and I refer you to my opening overarching comments and then the response I gave a few minutes ago to the first wave of these submissions. I don't think I need to add anything further.
Okay, thank you.
Mr Griffiths has yet to find his glasses, so Councillor Waters.
Thank you, sirs. I'm just taking advantage of the fact that this is sort of winding up for the afternoon. Seems a very long time ago since we all sat in the racecourse with all of this. I just wanted to offer my thanks for the way this, as it's the last time you'll have to put up with me, just offer my thanks for the way this has all been conducted, very professional, diligently, and more than anything else, amiably. So I look forward to your deliberations in due course, but thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor Waters. That's very kind of you.
It seems like a long time ago because it was. Yeah, thank you very much for those comments, much appreciated.
But we do have to go through the HW policies quickly. So I'm going to take them in turn. I'm not sure we need a start off, Mr.
So no preamble from me. If there's any points to be made, we'll respond to them.
Well, as I understand, and I think I'm right, but do correct me, do we have modifications to these policies proposed? We do, don't we? They're in the schedule.
Back of the matter statement, sir, is the easiest place for you to look at them. And actually, there is one point I'll address, because I'm sorry, Mr. Ainsworth is here from Camera, I think it is. There's a concern, can we strengthen it up? The short answer is we've heard that. We will do something about that. Let me indicate kind of very quickly what we have in mind. I'm just going to grab the right page. Hang on, just please bear with me. When one looks at policy HW1, protecting existing facilities, we see in the penultimate bullet point, in the case of commercial facilities, evidence is provided that demonstrates the facilities are no longer financially viable. That stays the same. But when you turn over the page, you see paragraph 610, supporting text. Final sentence deals with this. Evidence that facilities have been marketed for a minimum of a year without success, we require to demonstrate they are unviable. Delete that. And in goes 3 new sentences. The first sentence says 2 years marketing. The second sentence says a viability appraisal on an open book basis to show it's unviable. And the third sentence says a marketing report to explain what happened to each of the leads that was generated, if any, during that 2-year period. That's a pretty standard approach to dealing with these issues. It will include pubs because that they will fall within commercial facilities as drafted there. That's the only change that's not on the sheet that's before you, and hopefully I've dealt with Mr. Ainsworth's comment.
Mr. Ainsworth, what did you think to that?
That sounds great, yeah. Well, we very much applaud that. I think one of the points I was going to make was that the policy as it exists doesn't distinguish sufficiently between viability and marketing. I mean, they are separate issues, related but separate, and we would have liked to have seen a point 5 in the policy itself about marketing. Something along the lines of, sorry, I've written it down somewhere. Yes, also in the case of commercial facilities, evidence is provided that the premises have been appropriately marketed at a reasonable price, both locally and regionally, for a minimum of however, and you're now saying 2 years, which is an improvement. We just feel it ought to be in the policy separately, as well as in the explanation.
Okay, I hear that point. We'll take it away. Ms. Bartle will make a note. We might, for example, add, demonstrates the facilities are no longer financially viable and there is no interest from the market, or words to that effect, which would then tie in with the supporting text that I've proposed. We'll take that away. I'm not necessarily convinced by it, but I'm open to it.
I think from my point of view, if the supporting text is covering viability and a marketing exercise, then it might be as well correspond in the policy?
Sure, I accept that. I think the reason, having thought through these viability appraisals and cross-examined on them, you've got to do the marketing exercise before you work out what your profit's going to be to get to your, what's it, FMOP, isn't it? I'm sure Mr Ainsworth knows these things and what your reasonable operator will do. Yeah, we take the point.
Happily leave that with you. Does anyone have anything else about HW1? Mr Ainsworth, that was your main issue, wasn't it, that you raised in your reps?
Well, indeed. I mean, I'm standing in for Mr Love, who's a local person, who put in this submission, which contains a lot of detailed suggestions as to how the policy could be beefed up. But you've got that, so I can just let that lie. But the main point I wanted to clarify was that the issues around marketing were going to be properly covered, and it sounds like they will be, so that's really good. Thank you.
Thank you. That's helpful and positive. Anything on HW2, new community facilities? HW3? HW4, which I think there is a suggested change to this policy, isn't there? Have I got that right?
You have. I'll ask Ms Bartle just to give you the very short summary of what's going on in HW4, if I may.
Thank you. Yes, along with really all the changes that are proposed through these HW policies, they're intended for clarity purposes and simply to ease decision makers and applicants with the process in which they need to go through when preparing applications. The changes again don't go to the heart of the policy and its objectives. They really just provide clarity on the issues.
HW5 has been is proposed to be modified too, and I think that's generally to deal with
yes, that's an update.
Primary and secondary.
I don't think we need to say much on this, but I say to make one general point. There's a few reps on it about, well, I think we've heard extension to the hospital, etc., etc. The short point is that we have produced this in consultation with the local NHS trust and have taken on board essentially everything they've said, and they haven't identified a specific need for either an allocation or any sort of safeguarding. So we have done that exercise, and what you see before you reflects the product of that discussion.
I've just noticed I must have doubled over a page that HW3 is proposed to be modified as well, and indeed HW1 and HW2. I don't know if you want that. I mean, it seems to me to be self-evident, but I mean, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say about those. I didn't want to deny the opportunity.
So no, we're happy to take it as read.
Anything on HW5? HW6 deals with the emergency services. HW7, the last one, healthy places. I'm just catching up with myself. There are some changes proposed to these. I don't know if Mr. Henderson, you wanted to briefly cover those?
Over to Ms Bartle, sir.
With respect to HW6 and the emergency services, the deletions in that policy are really the result of ongoing discussions with the ambulance service and the as-was requirements that they were seeking at the time that the plan was prepared have moved on and advanced, and it's no longer necessary to seek specific sites in the way that it was articulated originally, and a more general approach is considered appropriate. On HW7, the healthy places, again, additional clarity on building design at all different stages and suitable for all ages, rather than only referring to limited mobility. Other matters, the inclusion of at the penultimate bullet point, the lighting strategies for public spaces is a recognition of designing out crime approaches widely accepted, and all other modifications are simply clarifications to aid its effectiveness.
Excellent, thank you. Is there anything on HW7? Is there anything else? Then I'll draw proceedings today to a close. Thanks everyone for being for your brevity, including in their absence, Mr. Merritt and Mr. May. Good. Until tomorrow morning at 9:30 then. It's the final programmed hearing session of Phase 4. Until then, thanks everyone. Good afternoon.